Thank you. I'm going to try in my time to talk about the relationship between religion and well-being. It's going to be broadly theoretical. I'm going to look mostly at the kind of academic evidence, but I am going to try very hard to ground it in something a bit more challenging and practical towards the end. The immediate massive problem with talking about religion and well-being is that those two terms are exceptionally difficult. What on earth are you talking about by either of those terms? If you're talking about religion, do you mean a specific religion? Do you mean Christianity? Do you mean a denomination of Christianity? Or do you mean something far more general, religion in principle? Do you mean something as broad as spirituality itself? And given that those things are so different, how can we possibly talk about any of them in relationship to something else? And if that one's difficult, then we haven't even started with what on earth well-being means. And if you look at various different academic studies into well-being, you'll find they're measuring completely different things. Well, last year, my organisation, which is Theos, which is a Christian think tank based around the corner, we tried to bring a little bit of clarity to these issues. We produced this report, which is Religion and Wellbeing, Assessing the Evidence. You can download it from our website for free. If you're interested, it's theosthinktank.co.uk. In that report, what we do is we analyse 140 different academic studies that have been done over the past 25 years or so into everyone who's talked about religion and well-being. What we've tried to do is disambiguate those two terms into a grid which is barely legible, but tries to kind of split out some of those terms into more meaningful categories that you can then map against each other. So along the top there, you've got different ways of thinking about well-being, subjective well-being, mental health, physical health, and health-supporting behaviours. And down the side, you've got different ways of thinking about religion, affiliation, subjective religiosity, religious belief, group participation, and personal participation. Worth noting, I'm going to be focusing on simply that one column, mental health, but looked at through the different kind of religious lenses. It's worth noting that these academic studies that looked at mental health are generally looking at quite a narrow vision of mental health, probably narrower than most of the people here are going to be talking about. They're generally talking in clinical settings. Several of the reports, for example, the studies are looking at things like cancer recovery. So they're looking in quite a narrow medical field of mental health. Nonetheless, let's have a look a bit more in what they're saying. So the first of those religious categories is affiliation. Now, affiliation is very simply what you call yourself. It's what you tick on the census. It doesn't tell you anything about what the person who's ticked that box really believes or what they do or what they think. It just tells you that if nothing else, they've said that they are religious. And the good news for Christians is that no study showed that there is a relationship between ticking that form and bad mental health. And nothing shows there's a definite bad relationship. Bad news is that nothing shows there's a good relationship either. In fact, basically, if you're just looking at affiliation, divorced from all other aspects of what it is to be religious, there's absolutely no relationship between that and mental health at all, which is a little bit dull, but we can get into much more interesting areas, because if we look at subjective religiosity, you get a very different story. What on earth is subjective religiosity? That is essentially, if you can imagine a question which asks you, how important on a scale of 1 to 10 do you believe your religion to be? 10 being the top and 1 being the bottom. That's what it is. So it's a sliding scale category. You can have very high subjective religiosity or very low. There are a number of studies which have been in this area, and they're quite interesting. One of the things it shows is that the vast majority of those studies show a link between high subjective religiosity and good mental health. So, for example, studies looking at people suffering with cancer and resilience, those who exhibited high levels of subjective religiosity also showed higher levels of resilience, and vice versa. So that is a category we can talk about which actually shows there is some sort of meaningful link between religion and mental health. Third category is belief. That's kind of the easiest one. It's, do you believe in X, Y, or Z? This is a really interesting category because it's by far the most mixed evidence. There are 14 studies which look specifically at religious belief and mental health. 6 out of 14 say there's a positive relationship. 4 out of 14 say there's a negative relationship. And the rest show no relationship at all. Now, what can we possibly get out of that? Well, there's some clues. And probably the reason for that is because it depends on what belief you're talking about. So, for example, 2 studies, one in the States, one in Japan, which looked at people who were having a close loved one who was dying. And specifically, they were looking at whether people believed in the afterlife or not. Perhaps not surprisingly, people who believed very strongly in an afterlife had lower levels of hypertension. They bounced back better from that significant other dying. So that belief, you can say, there's a kind of positive link. Other beliefs, that's not the case. We could point, for example, to religious aspects of ritualization. Well, for those with OCD, that might not be a positive relationship. You're talking about depression and obsession with particular types of sin. Again, that might not be a positive link between the two. So we have to be careful with what belief we're talking about. 4th one, and this is the most interesting one I think, is participation in religious group activity. So that might be going to church, it might be volunteering for a Christian charity. There are various things that the different studies are looking at. There's a lot of studies in this area, I mean dozens that have been done over the years, ranging across different countries, different religions, all sorts of interesting things going on. Essentially, all of them show there is a positive relationship between involvement in religious group activity and mental health. So one study concluded that frequent churchgoers are about half as likely to be depressed, for example, from their study. Now, it's worth noting, in the interests of complete honesty over this, that any group activity is good for mental health. Joining a bowls club is also good for your mental health. But interestingly, several of these studies showed that even compared to those other group activities, the religious ones were scoring better, or at least as well or better, in basically every case, particularly when it was combined with strong subjective religiosity. So if you care about your religion and you do something about it, that's the kind of holy grail of kind of healthy mental health. Finally, personal participation. So this is things like prayer, things you do which are religious activities, but you do them on your own. Again, there's a sort of link we can see, some sort of relationship. It's one of those ones which requires a bit more careful interpretation. Because, for example, you can look at the data in this area and say that people who pray a lot are more likely to be depressed. But you have to think about that quite carefully. What that doesn't tell you is the causality. What that might simply be showing you is that people who are in trouble tend to seek more help, including prayer. So it's a kind of classic example which you have from a number of these, which is that none of this data actually tells you anything about causality. It doesn't tell you anything about the content of Christianity. It doesn't tell you whether there's really a God, for example. All it does is exhibits trends in these particular areas. That being the case, as I kind of move towards the end here, I thought that maybe it'd be interesting to talk about where we're going with this. That report was last year. At the moment, and coming out in July, we have a new report, which I've been working on, which is going to try and take those conclusions a bit further, and it looks at some of the ways in which we need to build on that and think about the content and how we actually act. Several things which I think could be taken further there. The first is a theological task, and here I absolutely echo basically everything that Reverend Will said before me. But there is a thing there, which is that given there is a relationship between religion and mental health, and we can point to that, we need to talk seriously about the theology behind it. There are loads of things you could talk about there, all sorts of things to do with sin, responsibility. The thing which is most interesting to me is the idea of relationships. If Christianity is a religion of relationships, we have a Trinitarian God as the kind of model for human interactions, then relationships are kind of at the core of it. We know from that previous slide that being in groups, being social, makes a difference. We know theologically it makes a difference. So how do we make all our interventions, all the services that we do in this area, maximally relational and linked in? Second thing would be a practical task, which is, firstly, if this matters, if there is a genuine relationship there between religion and mental health, then there's a kind of real onus on us to do something and to get fully involved in that space. If it makes a difference, what do we do about it? We know, in fact, there's a lot going on. So the part of the work I've been doing is trying to map all the Christian projects in mental health. It's an almost impossible task. There's absolutely thousands of them, many of them very small, some of them very large. How are they linked together? How do we work between them? How do we network them? How do we resource them? This is a practical challenge. And leading on from that, onto a third point, is that if this matters and if we need to be involved, then how do we make sure we're doing it in a way which is maximally effective and maximally impactful. And that involves some hard conversations about what impact looks like and how we measure that. And people working in the charity sector already beginning, I can see I'm losing you, but it is important that we can evidence this and that we can prove it. And it also involves a difficult conversation about how we work with secular and statutory bodies to make sure that we're not just on our own out there doing something, that it's fully networked and involved. I hope that's been helpful. Do be in touch with me if anything would be helpful. That report is out in July. Do look it up. We'll make sure it's sent over to Capital Mass. Thank you very much.